Thank you very much, Dean LaHaye, for your introduction and more importantly, for the invitation to be here tonight. It's an honor for me. I get the opportunity to lecture at universities and have done so a number of times over the years throughout my career across the country. And it's always a personal joy for me because of the many things that I do in my life, being involved in and associated with education, especially at the college level, has just always been close to my heart. And so I welcome having you all here, and I thank you for joining me. I'm going to talk to you about a project, but more importantly, and we kind of puzzled over what to call tonight's lecture. My first thought it could be called A Tale of Two Cities, because for those of you who know Atlanta, it is, isn't it? Another option was The Good and the Bad and the Ugly. That played well among my staff, but not so much on a screen. Then there was the thought that what we might do is say something more along the Olympic theme, that we would say it was the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. And it's going to be all of those things tonight. You're going to get to hear me talk a little bit about all those elements. This is a story about history. It's a story about race. It's a story about commerce and passion and progress. It's also a story about disinvestment and discard and neglect, and how all those things converge in the human experience that we call the city we live in. And it all converged in a place called Atlanta, and it did so for reasons that, in large measure, for most people, they kind of knew, but never fully understood. And what we're going to get to talk to you about is a project, and how that came about and why it is so important, not just to the citizens of Georgia, but that in a very unique way, the Atlanta Beltline has elevated our thinking and become a conversation point across the country and around the world. A week ago, actually 10 days ago, I was interviewed by CNN International for a global series they're doing on transformative cities. And they chose Atlanta because they wanted to talk about what the Atlanta Beltline was doing to the city. So that wasn't something we promoted. That was something that came out of this germ of an idea that started about 15 years ago. So the story starts a long time ago. I won't go through the entire 150-year history of Atlanta, but it is important for you to understand that Atlanta has always been a place of transportation, a place of movement. It's a place people came through. And for many of you who probably grew up in Georgia and may have lived in Atlanta yourself, you've always known it that way. And throughout each of its generations of growth, transportation and mobility have always been the centerpiece of what made Atlanta such a special place. It drove commerce, it made it one of the most prosperous cities in America, but it also changed the way that people related to each other, right? As transportation moved from trains to cars, it really transitioned from something that was much more centrally focused to something that was much more spread out. And the city itself became really an open ring, a core that really lost some of its life. And that obviously was the result not only of transportation and growth change, but it was the result of Atlanta being part of a very complex racial conversation. That was the heart of the American civil rights movement. That was the notion of us as a culture coming to terms with the idea that we may not all be equal, and yet we are. And so how do we manage that in the place that we live? How do we think about that in a way that gives freedom and license to us as individuals to express ourselves, to have what we want in life, but to also find ways to come together and embrace each other's unique differences and be a part of a holistic community? And the changes that took place really resulted in things like this, where in order to capture the power of mobility and the notion of expansion while giving ourselves license to live an individual life, really transitioned the heart of our city really into the pulsing arteries of an interstate freeway system. And this could look like any major freeway in America, but this is downtown Main Street, Atlanta. So that's the image that many people have of Atlanta. But believe it or not, that is not the Atlanta we know. There are really two very different Atlantas, and it is about two cities today that we now live. One city for which those of us who live in Atlanta know, and that is the city we'll talk about tonight, the city that is full of life, that is vibrant, that is dynamic, that is diverse, that's a little gritty, it's active, it's entrepreneurial, and it's full of activity. And then there's the life of Atlanta that people outside think of, which is this sprawling megalopolis that goes on for tens of miles, and instead of having an area of 450,000 people at its core, has an area of 6 million people at its farthest reaches. And the perception then is that all of these reaches are independent, that they're living their own lives and they aren't really connected. And it's really in part because of this that concept, that theory comes into reality. But this is the Atlanta that we talk about. This is the Atlanta we get to live. Many people know this is Piedmont Park and the lake at Piedmont Park. For those of you who in landscape architecture, you might have heard of a somewhat well-known landscape architect named Frederick Law Olmsted. The Olmsted brothers actually were the kind of main designers of Piedmont Park. They designed many parks and many cities across the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s. We don't realize their imprint was felt so far across the country. But there were people even then that made a very distinct observation about the importance of public realm, quality public realm, on the formation and identity of a city. Not because of its beauty, which is there, not because of its accessibility, which is there, not even because of its functionality as a park, which is there, but interestingly because of its economic utility. That the public realm has the capacity to actually change the way our cities grow and bring great vitality and life to the city. It is the place that makes it possible for us to come together, and then makes the development that we rely on for where we live and work and shop and entertain be more acceptable, more comfortable, more convenient. And so when we think about the Atlanta, this is the story of Atlanta that we are working toward. Why Atlanta? Why would something like the Atlanta Beltline happen in a city of Atlanta? Why not in New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Chicago? Well, there's a little known fact that many people want to live in Atlanta. Despite all of the prognostications of the snow jam that we just went through and everyone is leaving, although they couldn't get out, that might have actually been a ploy to keep everybody. The reality is that Atlanta is actually one of the most attractive cities and regions in the United States to live. It has been for many years and may well be, over the next 20 years, the hottest spot, no pun intended, to move in the country. And it's not for the reasons you might think. It isn't for its traditional growth patterns. It's not for its industrial base. It's not even for these major employers who've decided to make it their home. It's because people want to live in the city. People want to be a part of a vibrant culture, a culture that is attracting a combination of millennial, entrepreneurial achievers with aging baby boomers who love the city life and want the culture and the quality of life that comes with being a part of a walkable, compact environment where they can go to the grocery store, the restaurant, don't have to rely on their car. And believe it or not, Atlanta has all of those qualities. It just haven't always been connected. Getting there means also embracing the qualities that make it better. And great cities have a whole suite of things that we call capital. They have social capital, which means politics are in place to make them rich and strong. They have economic capital, which talks about the previous slide, in terms of commerce, the business environment wanting to commit themselves to occupy and claim their territory and their stake in making it a great city. They have environmental capital, a place people want to live because it's beautiful, it's rich, it's verdant, and it has not just the natural qualities of life, but the urban qualities of life. And then the most important one is often what I call intellectual capital. And great cities are not without major educational institutions, many of them. And if you think about the great cities of the world, they thrive even in the midst of radical change because they have all these capitals. They're all assembled in those places. When you don't have all those, cities struggle for one reason or the other. Whichever one is missing, it pulls the cities down. The city of Atlanta has elected over the years to continue to nurture all these things. And it has no doubt been not without a struggle to get those things to be successful. And it continues to grow. It has one of the largest concentration of colleges and universities in the country, believe it or not. More importantly, those colleges and universities embrace the city, and they contribute to the city. And this story is about one of those colleges, and a student from that college believed the city could be better than anyone else. And his name was Ryan Gravel, a graduate student at Georgia Tech, finishing his thesis in 1999, took it to one of his professors who thought he was crazy. It would never happen. He had this idea after going on a year abroad and visiting Paris. He had grown up in Chambly, which is just north of Atlanta. He lived his whole life in the suburbs, and his only trips growing up as a kid until he was in college was going to the city for a sporting event. So it was a long trip for him to go from Chambly to downtown Atlanta. And he believed that Atlanta was broken, abandoned, would never be a big city of great interest and repute. And yet, after visiting Europe, he discovered that he did not know Atlanta. He came back, and as he was developing his concept for a thesis, he realized he needed to peel back his perceptions of the city and understand what was really there. And in the process, Ryan discovered the assembly of 4 largely abandoned old railroad lines. Because he understood in Paris that what really knit Paris together to make it a vibrant city were its streets and its greenways. That for centuries, the people of France had said that it was important for everybody to be able to connect. No matter where they lived, they needed this fibrous network of connectivity that was available, safe, convenient, and beautiful. And he kept looking for that in Atlanta. And he found pockets of it in certain places. And it wasn't until he discovered these old 4 abandoned railroads that he realized that there was great potential for this. And he analyzed it and analyzed it. And he realized that what he had uncovered that others had seen in part was the possibility, a germ of an idea, to pull together these 4 largely independent, disconnected railroads into an actual connector of sorts, but interior connector that would bring the city together in a way it had never been before. In the history of Atlanta, through all of its interventions in transportation infrastructure, it has always striven? It has always strove, how's that? I'll get the brain to function here, to improve the transportation network, but not connect everybody. You understand why? Because there was always this notion that we did not want everyone connected. And so as each successive generation came along and built the major infrastructure investments, all the way up to and including the interstate freeways and even the MARTA system, decisions were made to make extraordinary, massive infrastructure decisions with permanent consequences on the fabric and culture of the city, and yet they didn't meet all the needs of all the neighborhoods. They systematically either, when they were ultimately implemented, didn't finish, diverted, or cut right through. And the consequence with that was actually to reinforce the segregation of the city. And so while we don't think about social issues and race in the context of the built environment very often, in fact, it is largely the most powerful personality imprint of who we are as a people in anything we do. Let me repeat that in a different way. Our cities are a reflection of us, right? When we think about the creation of place, think about the place you live. Most of you probably living in your studios. You try to possess that, nest there, create an environment that reflects you as a person, as long as your professors will let you. And if they don't, you'll do it at your apartment or at the home you're sharing with 27 other students. And in the process, you're about creating an environment that says, yeah, I'm part of the community, and this is who I am. Believe it or not, we also do that in our cities. Every day of the week, we make political, financial, and technical decisions about how we build our cities that reflect to the outside world who we are as a people, both in time and space. And transportation is arguably the most significant investment we make and has more influence on land use and place than anything else that we do. And Brian began to discover how these decisions over a century had done two things. They had systematically kind of continued and advanced that theory, but at the same time, they had created this area of what I characterize as benign neglect, and he characterized as this germ of opportunity, where these railroads who had wanted to get out of the city built these perimeter railroads called the Beltline, and all 4 Beltlines were there to get away from the city. But what happened as the city grew out, the Beltline became the barrier again. And the neighborhoods on either side never connected, even when they could. Street names are even different, because people didn't want to know who was on the street or didn't want others on the same name street. So how fascinating is it that in all our efforts to think about the notion of living in a diverse society, to acknowledge that there's this history that continues to permeate everything we do, both in how and where we live, and even how we think about life. And absent intervention, we become complicit in and subscribers to that philosophy. It's not always a bad thing. In many cases, we get lucky and we get to subscribe to a great experience, don't we? But in some cases, we don't realize that we've been asked to live in an environment that really isn't conducive to quality of life, that isn't really conducive to coming together, that isn't conducive to creating a culture in which people feel they're one with each other, and in a culture, in a place that is beautiful and is healthy. And what Brian discovered is that the first move he felt he could make in his thesis was to break the back of the worst part of it. Largely abandoned railroads, he concluded, needed to be connected again. And so he came up with this basic germ of an idea to build a transit system, a streetcar or a light rail system that would circumnavigate this entire old 4 railroad Beltline network, connect them together, and create a 22-mile loop that would, for the first time, connect all the neighborhoods of the city. It was a pretty ambitious idea. You could imagine, on the face of it, it sounded kind of cool if you didn't really think about it. Because if you go back to my earlier comments about how, as we build our cities, we make statements about who we are, this was a pretty significant and fundamental departure. Because it expressly said, we're going to use these unintended assets as a way to connect all these neighborhoods. You follow me? So there's an underlying thinking about how powerful that is as an idea. So Brian finished his thesis, he collected a lot of these ideas, and he graduated. And he went on to work. And not too long after that, some classmate friends of his said, you know, you can't let this idea die. This is bigger than us. And he wasn't so sure, but we went along with them, and they convinced him to put together a little white paper that he would then shop around. And they sent it to state legislators, city council members, they sent it to business community leaders, leaders in the community of faith, neighborhood association leaders, environmental advocates. And lo and behold, a city council member named Kathy Woolard, who at the time was about to become council president, had been struggling over a transportation problem between 2 neighborhoods. And she felt like there was no real thinking about the role of transportation in designing the community, in bringing people together. It seemed to be these fractured little acts that were like putting a Band-Aid here and there, but never really thinking systematically. And she lit on the idea of the Atlanta Beltline as a way to begin a conversation. Not at the government level, but at the neighborhood level. First time that had ever happened, right? A city over 100 years old wanted to have a conversation starting at the neighborhood level and then rising up to conform public policy. And so that happened. In 1999, Ryan completed his thesis. By 2002, Kathy, Ryan, and others had really started to get some traction around this notion of grassroots support. And after that, it moved on to real-world testing. Could it actually be done? The Trust for Public Land funded a study where they brought in Alexander Garvin, for those of you who've heard of him. Alex is actually a friend of mine and one of the most famous planners in the world. Came from New York, took one look at this, and before he even completed his feasibility study, knew in his initial reaction, this could well be one of the most transformative acts a city could ever do. And he did not look at it as a transportation project. He saw it as a green space project. He saw it as a park project. He saw it as a wildlife corridor project. He saw it as an affordable housing project. He saw it as an economic development project. All out of one germ. And so what ended up happening was not only was it proved feasible, but that study called the Emerald Necklace, the Atlanta Beltline, resulted in the city of Atlanta working with all 45 neighborhoods to put in place the first ever tax allocation district, to establish a formal area to encompass the entire 22-mile loop for the purposes of actually funding the project. That fundraising to do that was not through public means. It actually came from the private sector, from nonprofit organizations, major foundations and philanthropies, and donors, people like you and me, who just believed that this was the right thing to do. It didn't seem to be possible that there would be any other alternative. In 2006, something even more remarkable happened. The tax allocation district passed by the unanimous consent of the City Council. 45 neighborhoods, for the first time in the city of Atlanta, had said yes to something together. Now that seems like a pretty simple statement to make today. But think about it. Atlanta, 45 neighborhoods, distinctly different, with a lot of history, many of those still living. And they said, for once, this is going to happen. We believe in this. We're committed to it. And this isn't small. In fact, this is bigger than any one of us. It is not possible, they said, for any one of us to do. It'll only be possible if we all do it. Imagine, 22-mile project, the largest redevelopment project in the United States, in the city of civil rights, coming together, 45 neighborhoods, and a city council saying yes, that this is the right thing to do. But that's not the end of the story. That's just the beginning. What came out of that was not only the district and the formation of the district, but the actual creation of 2 companion organizations that were needed in order to advance the program. One called the Atlanta Beltline Incorporated, which is where I work, and my director of design, Fred Uloris. Are you nodding off, Fred? He's heard me tell this story before. So he's here with me tonight. And our team, that's where we live. And our job is to complete the vision. It's not our vision, it's your vision. Anybody who wants to live and own and possess the Atlanta Beltline, in Georgia for sure, and increasingly from across the country, has a stake. It's that big. But more importantly, They not only own it, but each of you has an opportunity to influence it. And while the framework that Brian endorsed set the tone, and the study that Alex Garvin completed solidified the feasibility, it took 10 planning studies over a 5-year period from 2007 to 2012, led by the Atlanta Beltline, Inc. and the City of Atlanta, to actually convince the neighborhoods to put in place master plans for the entire 15,000 acres that constitute the Atlanta Beltline. Now, how many of you have any planning background? Just a few? So what I will tell you for the rest of you is trying to do a master plan in a major metropolitan city at any scale and get it through the neighborhood planning process, the business community, and the multitude of bureaucracies of city government and a city council approval takes about 5 years. To do 10 in 5 years, I've never seen before. I believe that had something to do with the sheer momentum, the kind of urgency of this idea, the momentum behind it, and the belief, despite resistance even at many quarters, that this had to continue, that we had to put in place the structure to make it possible. So the entire corridor, broken up into 10 sub-areas, had master plans not only completed in 5 years, but over the last 3 years of that 5 years, all adopted. So that by 2012, they were all complete. But that wasn't all. In the meantime, we created a companion organization called the Atlanta Beltline Partnership. And this was really the grassroots group that Ryan and Kathy Woolard came up with. It was called the Friends of the Atlanta Beltline. But it went to the next level. And in a very unique way that does not exist, to my knowledge, really anywhere else in the country, they were formed into a formal 501c3 nonprofit advocacy organization for the purposes of advancing the vision from the neighborhood level. So that the grassroots initiative that made it possible became an institution. And those grassroots voices that started in 2002 and 3 actually would continue to be heard. And not only be heard, but grow. And today, we have about 50,000 members of the partnership who contribute to, who participate in, who friend us through Facebook, who tweet about us on Twitter, and who are connected through volunteer hours in many ways to helping the Beltline not only come to completion, but to become this life activity place, this place we now come to, for which it creates opportunities for health and recreation, entertainment, art, and many other qualities. Those two companion organizations must exist in order for this to continue. The one that's there to advance the ball, and the others that's there to make sure it's done well. And there's a healthy tension, you can imagine. But it is critical that they continue to be successful in order for this to work. Now, that's the good and a little bit of the bad, but then there's the ugly, right? Something happened in 2008. I'm not quite sure what it was. I think we all know, right? We had a little thing called the Great Recession that hit. And at the same time that hit, the Atlanta Beltline and its tax allocation district were hit with 2 lawsuits from folks who didn't care about the project or the program or the vision or all of this incredible inertia of commitment that had emerged, but just believed that the city should not be spending its money that way and it shouldn't be taxing people. And so they went all the way to the state Supreme Court. The good news is the Beltline won. But in the process, it took 5 years out of the revenue from the tax allocation district. It was a massive setback. And combining that with a 5-year recession cut the entire tax revenue from the district in half. So under any other circumstance, in almost any other city, the project would have died. But it didn't. It motored on because what came forward? Private philanthropy. And in a sense of kind of, we will overcome the resistance of those who do not believe in our ambition and those who do not believe in the mission of our 45 neighborhoods believing that we will come together. They brought together private philanthropy. They raised $41 million, and they began to help fund the first phase of the project. And out of that came what we now know as the East Side Trail and historic Fourth Ward Park, which I'm going to talk about. And those two pieces kind of anchored forever in a way that can never turn back the commitment of the Atlanta Beltline to the citizens of Atlanta and its region. A lot of skeptics, not because they don't believe in it, but because the kind of unreality, the surreality of something so grand doesn't seem possible, so it comes across as it probably shouldn't be done. It's not going to happen, right? We all do that, don't we? Somebody comes up with a great idea, and we think it's the greatest idea we've ever heard of, but what is our reaction when we realize how ambitious it is? It's probably not going to happen. And that even became an undertone for many years. So a recession, lawsuits, racial divides, all those things are overcome, and this project continues. It gets us to the point where we are today, where we not only have advanced the program, but this last December, our board of directors adopted the first ever long-range implementation plan for the Atlanta Beltline that actually puts in place exactly how and what we will do to complete the entire program, which I'm going to go through, by the year 2030, which is the end of the tax allocation district life. They adopt it unanimously. And it actually, surprisingly for a city that doesn't have a history of planning, per se, at least not adopted plans that are required to be implemented, was received to great applause, including, and I'll say this quite candidly, to the far conservative Republican right. Those who were against public investment in cities, those who don't believe that the city should be spending money and aren't big believers in planners. That very conservative, very prudent, business-minded community described in Peach Pundit's blog the best planning document they'd seen come out of Atlanta in their history. And they wish this was done more. So that signaled to us something more going on than just a good idea. So let me talk to you about where we are and what's involved. Because it is, by any stretch, I hope you will conclude with me, a big project. Connects all 45 neighborhoods of the historic city of Atlanta. It actually encompasses, of its 450,000 people, 22% of our population. So we have a lot of direct constituents who live and work in our neighborhoods that are within the specific boundary of the Atlanta Beltline. It's almost 20% of the city. And we are not a government agency. Did I mention that? The Atlanta Beltline is a private nonprofit corporation. And yet we have the responsibility and the influence over a lot of things that happen in pretty much that entire 22-mile loop, making up the 15,000 acres, or 20% of the city. But key to this, and this is just one really interesting reference, during the course of our effort, we will put 40% more parkland into the city's park system. That's just through our program, which says two things. It's a big project, but it also says Atlanta was incredibly underparked. And I'm using the green type in this case. Plenty of parking the other way. And the tax allocation district, interestingly enough, that is our base funding source, not all of our funding, as you now know, only constitutes 6,500 acres, or about 35% of the actual plan area. And that was in order to preserve all taxes that would accrue over time for the residential neighborhoods that people live in, for schools and social services, and only capture the increments for use that are in the areas that are of redevelopment or of industrial, commercial, or income-producing status, where you don't have a lot of kids going to school, you don't have a lot of people living yet, and so that makes sense to be investing back in those areas. And those are also largely the areas most impacted when the railroads were here, and then most disinvested in when the railroads pulled out. Thousands of acres of land with industrial buildings either underutilized or abandoned. Huge fields of concrete. In fact, at the time, well, I'll talk about this in a moment. It is, without exception, at the heart of the Atlanta region. It actually connects, and this was largely because of Ryan's extraordinary work, most of the major attractions in the city. And it utilizes essentially an abandoned freight line in its relatively existing form for a new, renewed purpose. So a lot of what this is about is bringing this back to life, right? Giving new purpose to a place that was abandoned, that had exercised and exhausted its useful life. And instead of just tearing it down and abandoning it, which is what the railroads did, recognizing that it has a new purpose that extends beyond ours. The major components of the Atlanta Beltline start with our parks, our trails, our transit, and our streetscapes. We call those the backbone. They are the elements that really frame everything that we do, and they are the infrastructure, the real projects that kind of set the tone. We call them our inputs. They're the things that define the character and the culture of the neighborhoods. They are the public realm. They are the places that have to be beautiful, accessible. They have to be convenient. They have to be healthy. They have to be green. But to make that work, we also have to have outputs. We have to know that we've actually stimulated an environment that grows up with jobs, with economic development, and with homes, with a diversity of homes, from very affluent homes to very affordable homes, so that we can have a true integrated mixed income community with mixed uses for residential, retail, office, and institutional purposes. All the while making sure that we don't do what others did before and neglect the jewels, the gems, the special spaces that are still there. Because believe it or not, the remnants of the railroads are some of the most extraordinary pieces of infrastructure in America. And we are trying to keep the best pieces of those. Some of the leftover landscapes that the railroads inherited were never touched. Pieces of them we're able to keep almost in their primeval state. We have one project area on the east side we called Three Tree Hill, which has 3 old growth oaks on it that are now one of the most popular places on the East Side Trail for people to go. And it had been called Three Tree Hill for a while. And so we recognize there are these cultural attributes unique to elements and areas around the Beltline that we have to give away, that we have to let the place possess as we design, and we have to let the community possess. As a designer, it is my greatest honor and challenge to give away design to our community. And yet, it's their project. So how do we interpret those things? How do we express those things? How do we pull that from our community in a way that those things become emblematic? Not of just the Beltline community itself, but more importantly, every one of those 45 unique neighborhoods, each one with a different history, some of them with international significance, and all of them with a different story to tell. And so we think about that every day. What are those uniting themes? How do we connect those threads that link the Beltline together while creating jewels, opportunities for expression, and interventions that actually tell a story that relates uniquely to the people who live there? And we do that through art. We do that through landscape. We do it through design. We even do it through material selection. We incorporate a lot of historic materials or materials of emblematic quality that kind of remind us of some of the things that used to be there. But more importantly, we do it through the design of the trail itself in order to make it this thing that everybody identifies with that has its own unique brand. So we've thought even down to the level of saying how we design the trail makes a statement about whether we are really coming together. We had meetings last night. We had what we call our quarterly briefings with citizens from all over the city. We actually had somebody who came up to us at the Q&A session at the end and was complaining because as we're getting ready to build our next major segment of the Beltline on the west side of town, they had noticed a segment of trail had been built and there was a sign on it that signaled that it was part of the Beltline. And how could that be part of the Beltline? Because it wasn't like the Beltline. Isn't that interesting? It was a very subtle but poignant statement. Well, the reality was that was an early piece of trail that was built as a connector. And there are connectors on the east side too. It's just, this was somebody who did not know all the things that we were doing. But it raised their expectations and reinforced for us the level of commitment that we know we needed to fulfill in order to continue to advance the grassroots vision and mission of the Atlanta Beltline. 22 miles of transit, bi-directional transit system that will interconnect with the Cities of Atlanta streetcar program that's under construction right now. 33 miles of trails, 46 miles of new streets and streetscapes, 1,300 acres of new parks and over 700 acres of rehabilitated parks. Are my numbers getting big enough yet? Over 1,000 acres of brownfields cleaned up and put back into productive use. Over 5,000 workforce housing units to be built as part of an effort to put over 25,000 new residential units of housing around the 22-mile corridor. Over 30,000 jobs, permanent jobs, 48,000 construction jobs. And you add all that together, and the program requires us to advance a mission to create over $10 billion in new development around the Atlanta Beltline. All within the historic downtown core of Atlanta, connecting 45 neighborhoods that were designed never to be connected before. So any one of those efforts would have likely been a cause for a lecture, but to imagine that we all get to do that on a daily basis is a little overwhelming. We sometimes get tired just reciting the statistics of what we're committed to. But we keep track of it, and we commit to it every day. But there are some themes that evolve when you try to not just design and build a project, but you decide to participate in a social experiment. Because we don't get to decide the rules of the social experiment, do we? The community does. So all we get is the tools, and they tell us how to use them. And so what we've done is we've been able to identify, over the last 8 years, a variety of interventions that begin to track and attack this list of obligations. And you can see how they begin to line up around the Atlanta Beltline. You could say, that's not bad progress, right? We've made some good progress. The blue line constitutes the 22-mile loop. The little teardrops are all the different things that we've been able to make progress on. Some of these are scheduled park sites, not yet built, but it gives you some context. And at this point, this area right here is the only trail segment that's been built. In that area, you see lots of teardrops, don't you? Some of that was intentional. Doing a project at scale demands, and this is not a violatable principle, that you must come out of the gate with a victory, even if it means upsetting some participants. Okay? You don't get to not do that. You must come out of the gate with a successful first phase. So that was both the right thing to do, but also caused some of the most acrimony with the grassroots initiative. Because the east side is not where the community of need has its homes. And the risk we ran when that was chosen was that we were about to do what every other transportation infrastructure project had done over 100 years. And what was that? Avoid, abandon, steer away. And yet we had to convince the community that we had to prove the promise, right? And show them that the Atlanta Beltline was for everyone. And that everyone could use it. So we had to make it accessible, and we had to rely on the Atlanta Beltline Partnership to help tell that story, right? So they not only told the story, they had to get all of those communities, all 45 neighborhoods, to believe it was theirs. Now, we had done small pieces. We had done, in 2007, through the Path Foundation, a small leg on the west end, but it wasn't actually on the Beltline, and it wasn't actually the Beltline model trail. We did an element up in the northwest through what's called Tanyard Creek, but that wasn't exactly on the Beltline. It was another path project. It is part of the Beltline, but it wasn't the Beltline trail. So while people embraced those elements, they just weren't quite sure it was the Beltline. That standard had already been set. It had kind of been forged in a way that wasn't going to shift. So what we ended up doing was realizing that we had to make some change. But before we did that, we had to understand, did we not only make progress, and what did we learn from that, but did we achieve any tangible success? And believe it or not, at the outset of this conversation, I made a comment, I think, about the history of Atlanta and how Atlanta was famous for not only infrastructure and transportation and mobility, but for what? Progress, economic development, right? Growth. And that is etched into the DNA of the culture of our city. So we needed to find a way to communicate in those terms the value proposition. That's the term we use for what we were doing. And that was in their terms, return on investment. And they looked at the $360 million that constituted all this work, and they said, what did you get for that? Well, in the last 8 years, since that $360 million of both public and, as you remember, front-end, largely private investment was put in the ground, there has been now $1.1 billion of private development. So for any of you who've ever had aspirations to be a finance or investment banker, that's about a 3-to-1 return on ratio. That would be an investment anyone would take. Let me put it a different way. If you put your money, $1 in the bank, and you got $3 back, how many of you would put it in that bank? Not everyone? I'll talk to you afterwards. Today's investments, if you're lucky, give you a 20% return. That's the best. 3-to-1 in 5 to 7 years is off the charts. And we believe that's just the start. We believe the potential for that exists throughout the entire program. We also know that that's not the total value, because we only counted within the 6,500 acres, not of the TAD, not the entire 15,000 acres of the Beltline plan. So we know there's even more investment that took place. And this began to ring a bell for the region and change their thinking about the power of public infrastructure investment, public realm commitment. Because we haven't even built the train yet. This is just acquiring about 60% of the right-of-way, putting in some temporary hiking trails on the portion that aren't built, and completing a 2-mile segment of the paved trail component with some key parks. This is what we were doing. We took over a kudzu-infested, many of you are landscape architecture students. You all know your favorite plant is kudzu, right? Yeah, commit that to memory, never do it again. People didn't even know the tracks were there. It was so overgrown with kudzu. On the right is about a year ago, when the trail had just been completed and housing was already showing up. This project had actually originally been designed with these units having their back to the corridor. What you're looking at are the front porches on these townhomes. Okay? As this trail was completed, most of the developments along here, this was their back fence. This was their storage area. It's probably where their dumpsters were. Fences were built at their request. If you go along the East Side Trail today, guess how many fences you will see? 0. They're all down. Not only are they down, many of those businesses have now turned their business around. If they don't have outdoor seating, actual merchandising, they've all got at least an entry and free water for those who are on the trail. And there are hundreds of businesses. And some of the best restaurants in Atlanta have now chosen the Atlanta Beltline as their home. And their most popular restaurants are the Atlanta Beltline. So it has become, in its own unique way, a new address. We all know that street appeal is one of the greatest selling points of economic development. And in the business community, address is everything. So for us, the real vote happened when businesses decided they wanted to turn their businesses around and face the Beltline, and not the front of their streets. And that continues to happen. The corridor on the East Side Trail, before the trail got built, looked like this. Up here in the right-hand corner, you'll see what is the old Sears Roebuck building, the largest brick warehouse distribution center in the Southeast. 2 million square foot building, largely abandoned, owned by the city. That building actually housed part of the city's archives, legal records, and other things. They called it City Hall East, but every year almost it flooded with combined sewer overflow from Clear Creek and the neighborhoods because of all the development that had happened and the way the railroads had built the railroad corridor through the area over the last century. It had basically covered over the Clear Creek, and it didn't have anywhere else to go, and this was the low spot. So the city had this 2 million square foot asset that they couldn't do anything with, and a stormwater problem that was on the verge of heading into an EPA lawsuit. And along came the Beltline. And that's what it looks like today. So that's not a bad change. I'd take that. And that's just the start. We haven't even completed the landscape. On the left is the main corridor. On the right is where the transit will eventually be built. In many cases, I talked about preserving the bridges. This is one crossing Ponce de Leon Avenue. And that's what it looks like today. We restored the bridge. We made it our main pedestrian trail. When the transit comes through, we'll add another segment. This is a little further down the line. This is one of the industrial areas. Those buildings were all vacant on both sides of the corridor before the Beltline came through. Many of these warehouses were brownfield sites. They were derelict. In fact, this whole area was largely kind of a crime drug zone. The AJC had some very choice words for this neighborhood at the time. The old Fourth Ward was not the greatest place to live. And this is what it looks like today. And for those of you who are familiar with Kevin Rathbun, this is, I believe, his steakhouse is right in there, or one of his restaurants. Kevin Rathbun, you ever heard of him? Those of you who watch Chopped or Iron Chef, he won both. Atlanta original. And he chose to put two of his restaurants on the Atlanta Beltline since it opened. Something to think about, right? But this is really the first jewel of many around the Beltline that changed the game. This is the site where all that flooding happened. And I think I've got a good, this is the best picture I've got of this site. You can all take a picture of this and put it in your portfolio. This is the Atlanta Beltline. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution characterized this as the area of torn down, broken down, and dilapidated industrial warehouses, concrete slabs, pitching, and a barren industrial landscape for which the only redeeming quality was the concrete itself. That was how they characterized this before the Beltline came. When it was groundbroken, we actually had our contractor fake a lake. So that's not actual water. Sorry about that. Looks like a swimming pool. You would not want to dive into that. And then the bottom slides are what happened afterward. But what's more important about this particular project and its connection to the Atlanta Beltline corridor itself is that 2-mile segment and this park are responsible for $775 million of that $1.1 billion I talked to you about around the 22-mile loop. So this wasn't just dumb luck that we picked the right project. It was very clear that in a recession, and largely most of the development, in fact, probably 90% of the development happened in the last 5 years, where there was no development going on anywhere else in the region, right? Atlanta had one of the hardest hit economies in the country, had the second or third highest foreclosure rate in America. And yet, we saw during the last 7 years, 9,000 housing units get built through the recession on the Atlanta Beltline. We saw $400 million of redevelopment happen just around this park project next to the Beltline. The only other place in the city of Atlanta that saw any major development during that same period was Midtown, largely for very similar reasons. A commitment to the reinvestment in the public realm, supporting the renovations of Piedmont Park, 10th Avenue, and Peachtree, and all the other connecting streets that rebuilt, revitalized the urban grid, the fabric of that landscape for which all that development could then rise up. And it signaled to the marketplace when nobody had any money, there was still a place that those that did would want to develop. And they no longer went wherever they could, they only went where they should, right? So when things are bad, only the best places get money. So what does it say when the two biggest investment areas of the city are the Atlanta Beltline and Midtown? It says that something more than just location is having an impact. This is what it looked like. There's the Sears Roebuck building in the background, and that's today. A little sunnier and warmer than today. In fact, it's a little colder than here today. You see some of the housing under construction, and there's more that's come since. That project, that Sears and Roebuck building, once this was done, it wasn't there just to create a pretty park. It was actually there to solve one of the city's worst storm drain problems, right? Combined sewers, flooding almost annually. The Watershed Management Department, which is the engineering arm of utilities for the city, water and sewer, was about ready to be sued by the federal government and agreed to a stipulated order that they would build a tank in the ground to store a 100-year storm. Now start to think about that. We're talking about a tank the size of about a football field. Okay? Tens of millions of dollars. People involved in the Beltline, for whom this site had been identified as a future park, said, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way. So led by two landscape architecture firms, a suggestion was made that we do a non-structural solution. We actually daylight the problem and create a lake and build it with the structural integrity to handle not just the 100-year storm, but a 500-year storm. And oh, by the way, we'll do it for less money. And then on top of that, we'll add this little park space. So in the process, not only did it get done, not only has it worked, because in 2009, we got our first 100-year storm, and it worked. But it actually, and you can just barely see on the wall here, see these two little lines? The lower one is actually embedded in the concrete wall are stones continuing all around the wall that tell you the elevation of the 100-year flood. And that one higher is the 500-year flood. So people can actually go to the park and see where they'd be when the flood comes. So they're not there when it does. It's kind of a safety measure. But it works. And all the landscape is designed to be natural, native, managed through organic land care, So we don't use pesticides, herbicides in the park. Now we admittedly have to work with Parks Department who take over the maintenance. They have a special team now that manages it. But it works, and the landscape survives, it thrives. It knows that it's going to ultimately be underwater at certain times. Transportation, as I mentioned, we're only at about 56% of the right-of-way and 72% of the trail area under our jurisdiction. But we're moving forward. And this one takes a lot longer. We actually have to go through a very long, complicated, bureaucratic planning and environmental entitlement process or review and approval process in order to have the authorization to build. And it's a big project. It's about $2 billion of the total $4.5 to $5 billion program. So it's a big lift. And it requires federal partnering to do it. So not only are we having to work with all of our hundreds of partners in the region, but now we get to go to the federal government for their partnership as well. But it's working out, and we're getting progress. But what we're also doing is as we build the trail elements of each segment, we're essentially putting in place all the base infrastructure for the train. So even though when you drive by in your car and see the Beltline, or you're walking on the Beltline corridor trails, and you see this grassy area, what you don't know is it's almost ready for the train to come. We just have to come in, set the ballast, put the power lines up, build the stations, and the trains can go. So all the curvature and alignment is already set, all the bridges are built, all the stuff we need is kind of ready when we get the funding. It kind of allows us to use the trail phases to figure out all of the design questions without committing to the train too soon. So we get all that worked out before we end up having to build the train itself. To get there, though, involves a very complicated environmental process. And this is something that many of you, I hope, never have to go through. But the environmental impact statement process started with the advent of the Environmental Protection Agency as a way for the federal government to determine that any project of large significance did not produce unmanageable impact. And it focused primarily on what they thought would be the three major pillars of public health, and that was land, air, and water, right? So it looked at environmental issues, water issues, air quality issues. And it kind of evolved into this kind of somewhat elaborate, voluminous, somewhat self-perpetuating process where it really broadened well beyond that to really begin to think in holistic terms, and this is the good part, about how we grow our cities. And forces an alternatives analysis to make sure you're picking the right project and in the right way. And so we go through those processes and we do them in smaller measure for the trails because their impact is less, in large measure for the transit because its potential impact is large. And we're completing the first phases of those, actually the second phases. In 2012, we completed the first analysis and received what's called a record of decision for the transit for the 22-mile loop itself. And the way I tell people to think about that is we got to the FTA, or the Federal Transit Administration, who reviewed it, and they gave us an okay by viewing the project at 30,000 feet. Does that make sense? Now, in order to get to build it, we've got to get it approved at the ground level. So we're having to go into much more detail, segment by segment, and having them understand exactly where every track lane's going to go, how it's going to interface with intersections, what impact it's going to have on residential and business properties, how it's going to affect stormwater, so we don't do what the railroads did 100 years ago. All these things have to be worked out in the second stage. And that's what we're doing in the blue and orange and green areas right now. And what you see, just to give you a sense of orientation, is this is the first streetcar that's under construction right now and will open this late spring and early summer. We're going to be connecting to it, and the streetcar of the city will become the streetcar of the Atlanta Beltline. So the same vehicles will run on both. So if you live or work anywhere around the Beltline and you want to get into downtown and you want to take the streetcar, you'll be able to do it. And for those of you who don't want to do this, you won't have to transfer. You'll be able to get on one point and get off at the next stop. And that's really hugely important when you think about actually connecting the neighborhoods and making sure that this actually is a complete system, a network of transportation. The other thing we're doing, which is really quite remarkable, is affordable housing. And we have a framework that 15% of each tax allocation district bond measure that is issued, or a funding pot that's created out of the tax district, is set aside to support the creation and the essentially the buy-down costs of housing built around the Beltline. And our goal is to actually make it permanently affordable. And in some cases, that's for new homes, that people get down payment assistance. And in other cases, it's for developers doing multifamily projects. And so they'll either set aside 20% of the units as affordable, or they'll do the entire project at an affordable rate, and we'll help fund a portion of that so that we get two things out of it. Sustained affordability in the Beltline, because the last thing we want to do is create a project that brings all the community together and that forces all the existing residents out. And secondly, it gives us the opportunity to actually maintain that over time, right? Because we want to be able to not only have people move into the area, but we want to be able to keep and preserve affordability for those who already live there. It's also important because it signals that this is a place that we want people from all over the region who want to live in the city to have an opportunity to live in the city. It's actually very expensive to live in the city of Atlanta. And that would be counterproductive if we create one of the greatest things the city's done and not be able to have people stay there. We've partnered with a number of organizations and lending institutions to launch this effort. And we are really looking at doing it in three very simple ways. One is where we provide direct assistance. So developers of affordable housing come to us with a request for a grant, basically, to help them do their project. In other cases around the Beltline where we acquire and clean up properties, we will actually put the land into the project. And that will be our contribution. And then they'll be able to build their project without having to buy the land. And in a case like this, which is called the Lofts at Reynoldstown, a project we did ourselves, we'll actually do some projects. This is 28 affordable homes sold to residents and employees of workforce jobs in the city. Police, fire, medical, teachers. Many of whom had never been able to own before. Many of whom couldn't afford to live in the city. When we built this, there was speculation, and this opened during the height of the recession, that there would be much of a pipeline of applicants. When we closed on this and completed all the sales, we were only able to complete the first phase right out of the gate, 28 units. We had a waiting list of 1,600. So we think we hit a nerve. We think there's some demand, and we'll be using that as we go forward. Now, one of the things, and I'm glad he's here, is every so often we get lucky. And this project, which is characteristically kind of a guerrilla effort, if you think about it, it's kind of a crowdsourced project. If you put it in today's terms, it also is a way for people to express themselves. And so one of the things we did this year that we've never done before, well, not this year, but it's been evolving, and this year was kind of the most formal year, is we've developed not only the introduction of opportunities for people to display art, but we've started to establish permanent art around the Beltline. And a lot of the art that's being purchased is either indicative of or inclusive of elements of the historic Beltline itself. So this is another element that we're trying to thread around to tell the story about the city and its people, the Beltline and its culture, and ensure that the integrity of the story that got us to where we are is not lost on future generations. But at the same time, it's represented in a way that is transformative, that breathes new life into things. And the art on the Beltline is one of the most compelling things of all. It is a 2-month exhibition that runs in September and October each year now. It started about 5 years ago as a few artists that wanted to push some stuff onto the Beltline, and Fred Yoloris, our design director, said, yeah, well, I guess we'll let you do that, as long as you take it up, because we're probably going to have to take it up ourselves. And it kind of grew from there. And to the point where this year, we had, that was last year already. In this last September, we opened on the first weekend in September with 70 professional, emerging, and established artworks, both sculptures, murals, and performance art pieces over a 2-month period. And that continues to grow. What's exciting about it is that it's kicked off with what we call the Lantern Parade, which was also a spontaneous idea that started with a few people one night that they wanted to walk the corridor to tell people the Beltline existed. There were no lights. The first year it was on an unpaved nature trail. This year it was on the first 2-mile segment. And last year, it actually had just opened last year. There were about 1,200, which seems nice. This year, it broke 10,000. No advertising, no direct marketing. One piece that Saturday on NPR. And this is what it looked like at about 9 o'clock at night. People showing up spontaneously from all over the city, some from 10, 15, 20, 30 miles away, with homemade lanterns, their parents, their grandparents, their spouses, their friends, their kids, not only parading through the entire corridor, but lining the entire corridor to cheer them on. This was not like something they had to do. And for us, it really became the most powerful expression of the success of this dream that everyone bought into, called the Atlanta Beltline. I'm going to stop there. I could go into more detail if you want to hear about the strategic implementation plan, but it's a lot of technical stuff that talks more about the details of every project and when they're going to get built and how they're going to get built. But with that, I think you can get an idea of what the Atlanta Beltline's about, how we're going about doing it, and how our team at the Atlanta Beltline, Inc., in all our various disciplinary areas, are committed to this ambitious agenda more as its stewards than as its owners. So I thank you for your time.